A boy lies in the dark, on a bed made of reeds he pulled from the riverbank himself. He is 7 years old. His back is raw, 3 long welts from a leather strap still warm to the touch. He bites down on the edge of his blanket hard, because if a single sound escapes him tonight, the other boys will hear it. And if they hear it, tomorrow will be worse. Not because the instructors will know, because the boys will. What kind of place turns silence into survival for a 7-year-old? What kind of mother hands her son over to a system built to break him and calls it love? The answer isn't what you think. It isn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's something far older, far stranger, and far more misunderstood. A belief system so different from our own that for over 2,000 years, historians have struggled to explain it without flinching. Welcome back to Pillow and Poison. Before we sink into tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you tucking in from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments before you drift off. I always read them in the morning. Now pull the blanket up, dim the lights if you haven't already, settle into whatever position makes your eyes feel heavy, and let's go back. Back past the wars, back past the myths you've heard about Spartan warriors, all the way to the beginning. To a single night, in a single house in a city called Sparta, the night a mother held her newborn son for what might have been the last time, and didn't yet know it. This is not a story that starts on a battlefield. It starts somewhere much quieter, somewhere you'd never expect a society's cruelty to begin. It starts in a small stone house, lit by a single oil lamp where a woman named, we don't actually know her name. History rarely bothered to record the names of Spartan mothers. We know the names of their sons sometimes. We know the names of kings, generals, the boys who grew into legends. The mothers themselves have mostly disappeared into the silence of the past, which is in its own way the saddest detail of this entire story. So let's call her what so many women in this story were simply called Mita, mother, and it's the 8th day since she gave birth. In most of the ancient world, that alone would be remarkable. Many infants in the ancient Mediterranean didn't survive their first week. But this mother knows that surviving birth was never the real test. Tonight, men she has never spoken to, men who hold no tenderness toward her or her child, are going to look at her son's small body and decide, in a matter of minutes, whether he is allowed to keep living. Picture the scene with me. The house is small, 2 rooms, walls of sun-dried brick. Outside you can hear the distant clatter of a city that never fully rests. Sparta was not a place built for comfort, and even its nights carried a tension you could feel in your shoulders if you closed your eyes and listened. Dogs bark somewhere in the distance. A wind moves through olive trees outside the window, the kind of dry, warm wind that carries dust and the smell of the surrounding hills. The mother sits on a low wooden stool, her son wrapped in undyed wool, his face still soft with the particular calm of a newborn who has no idea. Yet what kind of world he has been born into? She studies his face in the lamplight. Small nose, dark hair like his father's, fingers curled the way newborn fingers do, as if they're holding on to something invisible. She has bathed him in wine that morning, not water wine, strong and undiluted. It's an old custom, one she herself was taught to believe in, without ever fully understanding why. The Spartans believed a sickly child would convulse, weaken or turn pale when bathed this way, while a strong child would simply tolerate it, almost as if his body already understood the price of weakness in this city. Her son had barely reacted at all. He had simply blinked and slept. She allows herself, just for a moment, the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe that means something good, but hope in Sparta was never something you were encouraged to hold on to too tightly. Because tonight a group of elders, men from the Gerousia, Sparta's council of elders, each of them over 60 years old, each of them having long ago buried whatever softness they once had, will come to inspect him. They will look at his limbs. They will look at the curve of his spine, They will check whether his cry when he is made to cry sounds strong or weak. And based on what they see in those few minutes, in that small stone room, they will decide something no parent today could imagine being decided by strangers: whether her son is permitted to grow up at all. If he passes, he will be handed back into her arms, and she will raise him, but only for 7 short years, because Sparta does not believe a child fully belongs to his mother. He belongs to the state from the moment he draws breath. If he does not pass, there is a place outside the city, the chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, where ancient writers tell us that infants judged too weak to ever become Spartan soldiers were left to the elements. We'll talk about whether that's entirely true later in tonight's story, because the real history, as it often is, turns out to be more complicated and in some ways more disturbing than the myth. If he passes, he will be handed back into her arms, and she will raise him, but only for 7 short years, because Sparta does not believe a child fully belongs to his mother. He belongs to the state from the moment he draws breath. If he does not pass, there is a place outside the city, the chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, where ancient writers tell us that infants judged too weak to ever become Spartan soldiers were left to the elements. We'll talk about whether that's entirely true later in tonight's story, because the real history, as it often is, turns out to be more complicated and in some ways more disturbing than the myth. But tonight in this small house, none of that is certain yet. The mother only knows this. Somewhere outside, footsteps are approaching. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, because for the men walking toward her door, this is simply routine. One more inspection, one more evening, one more child whose fate will be decided before he's old enough to remember it happening. She presses her lips gently to her son's forehead. Whatever happens next, she will not let her face show fear. And Sparta, even a mother's fear was something to be hidden. The footsteps stop outside her door, and so begins the story of how an entire civilization decided that a child's body did not belong to his mother, and how somehow, generation after generation of Spartan women came not just to accept this, but to believe in it. To understand why that knock on the door felt so inevitable, why a mother could sit there, frightened but unsurprised, you have to understand what Sparta actually was. Not the marble-columned, philosophy-loving image we often picture when we think ancient Greece. That was Athens. 100 miles away, a city of theaters and debate halls and men who spent entire afternoons arguing about the nature of justice. Sparta was something else entirely. Sparta was a city that had quietly transformed itself into a machine, and every person inside it, man, woman, child, free or enslaved, existed to keep that machine running. See, it hadn't always been this way. If you'd visited Sparta several centuries earlier, you would have found a city not so different from its neighbors. Early Sparta had poets. It had some of the most celebrated lyric poetry in the early Greek world. Soft, emotional verses about love lost the beauty of youth. Archaeologists have found delicate ivory carvings, fine pottery, jewelry, evidence of trade and artistry that doesn't fit the image most people carry of Sparta today, and for a while Sparta was simply a Greek city like any other, with the same appetite for beauty and music and comfort as its neighbors. So what changed? War changed it. Or more specifically, one war in particular, and the long, anxious peace that followed it. Sometime around the 7th century BCE, Sparta conquered a neighboring region called Messenia, a fertile stretch of land to the west. It was a brutal campaign, and at the end of it, Sparta didn't simply defeat the Messenians. They enslaved nearly the entire population, turning free farmers and their families into a permanent underclass called helots. The helots worked the land, grew the food, and produced the wealth that allowed Spartan citizens to stop farming altogether and dedicate their lives entirely to war. Here's the detail most people never hear. the one that explains everything that comes after it. Shocking fact. Historians estimate the Helot population outnumbered actual Spartan citizens by somewhere between 7 to 1 and 10 to 1. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being a small minority, ruling over a population many times your size, a population that despised you, that had once been free, that had every reason in the world to want you gone. That is the position Sparta put itself in. And once you understand that single fact, the rest of Spartan society stops looking like senseless cruelty and starts looking like something closer to permanent, institutionalized fear, because the Helots did rebel multiple times. The most devastating uprising, sometime in the mid-7th century BCE, nearly destroyed Sparta from within. A massive revolt that, according to ancient sources, lasted years and came dangerously close to ending Spartan rule entirely. Sparta survived, but barely. And in the aftermath, Spartan leaders made a decision that would shape the next 400 years of their civilization. Never again would they allow themselves to be caught unprepared. Every Spartan citizen from birth would be raised as a soldier. Every resource the city had would go toward maintaining the most disciplined, most feared military force in the entire Greek world. Poetry was not abandoned because Spartans hated beauty. It was abandoned because beauty does not keep a minority population in control of a hostile majority. Discipline does. This is the soil that the mother in our story was standing on. That night, holding her newborn son, she wasn't living inside random cruelty. She was living inside the long, slow-burning aftershock of a war fought generations before she was even born. A war whose lesson had been etched so deeply into Spartan culture that by her time, almost no one questioned it anymore. The fear of the Helots had become so deeply woven into daily Spartan life that it no longer felt like fear at all. It simply felt like the way things were done. This is also where the famous Spartan secrecy comes from. The silence, the discipline, the almost eerie calm that ancient writers from other Greek cities found unsettling when they visited Sparta. Other Greeks wrote about Spartans the way you might write about a quiet neighbor you suspect of hiding something terrible in their basement, admired, feared, and never quite trusted. And there's a particular cruelty hidden in all of this that's worth sitting with for a moment in the dark as you drift towards sleep. The Spartans built an entire civilization to protect themselves from an enemy of their own making. The Helots weren't foreign invaders. They were neighbors, families who a few generations earlier had been farming their own land, raising their own children, living lives not so different from the Spartans themselves until conquest turned them into permanent prisoners in their own homeland. Every Spartan boy who grew up enduring brutal training, every mother who learned to hide her tears, every harsh law that stripped away personal comfort in favor of collective strength, all of it existed because one civilization decided, generations earlier, that the only way to hold on to what they'd taken was to never, ever let their guard down again. That's the air this mother breathed every single day of her life. That's the fear baked into the walls of the house she sat in. When she heard those footsteps approaching her door that night, she wasn't just facing a strange ancient custom. She was facing the end result of an old terror, one her city had never fully recovered from and never tried to. It's almost peaceful in a strange way to realize that even the harshest, most unforgiving societies in history were usually not born from nothing. They were built slowly, brick by brick, out of fear, trauma, and the desperate human need to never feel powerless again. Sparta simply built that fear into something permanent, into law, into ritual, into the body of a single newborn child being studied right now by torchlight, by men who had long ago decided that softness was a danger they could not afford. The footsteps outside the door grow closer, and in the next part of our story, We step inside that room with her, to witness in full the inspection that would decide her son's fate and the strange, sobering truth historians have only recently begun to uncover about what actually happened in the chasm beneath Mount Taygetus. Okay, close your eyes for a second if you're not too sleepy to keep reading along in your head. I want you to actually picture this with me, not just hear about it. I want you standing in that room. You're not the mother. You're not even fully yourself. You're just there, a quiet presence in the corner of a small stone house in Sparta, somewhere around the 5th century BCE. The air smells like olive oil and wood smoke. The lamp on the table is the only light, and it's flickering slightly because someone just opened the door. 3 men step inside. They're older, 60, maybe 70. These are members of the Gerousia, Sparta's council of elders, men who have spent decades in service to the city, men who long ago stopped seeing newborns as anything other than future soldiers or future problems. They don't greet the mother warmly. There's no small talk. This is routine to them. You can feel it in the way they move. Unhurried, businesslike, the way a doctor might walk into a room they've walked into 1,000 times before. You watch as the mother holds her son out, just slightly, not handing him over yet, but presenting him. Her hands are steady. You almost don't notice that they're shaking just barely at the wrists. One of the elders steps closer. He doesn't smile at the baby the way you or I might smile at a newborn. He looks at him the way you'd look at a tool you're deciding whether to keep. He takes the baby's tiny arm between 2 fingers and gently extends it, checking the joint. He runs a thumb along the curve of the spine. He presses lightly just below the ribs. Here's something that might surprise you. This wasn't random superstition. The Spartans genuinely believed, and in their own way, they weren't entirely wrong, that visible signs of weakness at birth often did predict struggles later in life. They were looking for things like severe deformities, signs of illness, anything that, in a world without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without surgery, would likely mean a short and painful life, regardless of what Sparta did or didn't do. In a strange way, some historians argue, this inspection was Sparta's harsh, brutal version of something every ancient society quietly grappled with. How do you care for the most vulnerable, in a world that has almost no tools to actually help them survive? But knowing that doesn't make it easier to watch, does it? You're still standing in that room. You can still see the mother's face. The elders confer quietly, just a few words between them. You can't quite hear what they're saying. The mother can't either, and that's deliberate. The Spartans built distance, formality, and silence into almost every part of public life. Even something as intimate as whether a child lives or dies was handled, with the cold detachment of a bureaucratic decision, not a personal one. That distance was the point. It made the decision feel less like cruelty and more like process. Finally, one of the elders nods. He hands the baby back to his mother. You feel her exhale, not dramatically, not with tears, because Spartan women were raised, just like Spartan men, to control their emotions in public. But you can feel something in the room loosen just slightly. The baby has passed. If you'd been standing in this exact room on a different night, with a different mother, you might have witnessed something far harder to watch. If the elders shook their heads instead of nodding, the child would be taken from the house, carried outside the city, to a place ancient writers called the apothete, literally, the place of rejection, a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, the mountain range that towers over the valley where Sparta sits. Shocking fact. And this is where the story gets more complicated than most people realize. For centuries, historians simply repeated what ancient writers like Plutarch described: infants left to die in this chasm, a practice so accepted that no one in Spartan society questioned it. But modern archaeological excavations at the site believed to match these ancient descriptions have found surprisingly few infant remains, far fewer than you'd expect if this had truly happened on a regular basis for hundreds of years. What they found instead were mostly the remains of adult males, likely executed criminals or prisoners of war, suggesting this site may have served a very different purpose than the one ancient writers described. So what does that mean? It means we have to sit with some uncertainty here, the kind historians deal with all the time, but that we rarely talk about openly. It's possible that infant rejection did happen, but far less frequently than ancient sources claimed, reserved only for the most extreme cases. It's possible that rejected infants were sometimes given away instead, perhaps to helot families, or left somewhere to be taken in by someone else. A quiet, undocumented kind of survival that wouldn't show up in a chasm centuries later. And it's possible, maybe even likely this, that some of what ancient writers described wasn't strict historical record at all, but exaggeration, propaganda. A story Sparta let spread, deliberately or not, because a reputation for ruthlessness was, in its own dark way, a kind of protection. If your enemies believe you're willing to do anything, even discard your own children for the sake of strength, they think twice before testing you on the battlefield. Isn't that an unsettling thought to fall asleep to? That an entire civilization may have. Let the world believe something monstrous about itself, simply because being feared was safer than being underestimated. Either way, whatever truly happened at that chasm, however often it happened, the fear of it was real. And it shaped every single mother in Sparta, because even a small chance, even a story repeated often enough to be believed, was enough to make every Spartan woman understand the same lesson the moment she gave birth. This child is not fully yours. Not yet, maybe not ever. Not in the way mothers in other parts of the world understood motherhood. You watch as the elders leave, their footsteps fading back into the dark. The mother sits back down, her son now asleep against her chest, safe for tonight. But you already know, standing there in that room with her, that this was only the first test. The first of many, because passing this inspection didn't mean her son was free from Sparta's grip. It just meant Sparta had decided he was worth keeping. And in 7 short years, on a day she will dread quietly every single one of those years, Sparta will come back for him, not to inspect him this time, to take him. Let's stay in this house a little longer. Time moves differently now. Months blur into seasons, seasons into years. But I want you to stay close to this, mother, because the next 7 years matter more than you might think. They're the quiet years. The years almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. And they're the years that make everything that comes after so much harder to understand and so much harder to watch. You'd think, given everything we just witnessed, that a Spartan mother might hold back, might protect herself a little emotionally from a child she knows she'll eventually lose, might love him a little less fiercely just to soften the blow that's coming. She doesn't. If anything, it's the opposite. Picture early mornings in this house, the mother up before sunrise, the baby already awake, already being held, fed, sung to in a language we can only partially reconstruct from fragments of Spartan poetry that survived. Spartan mothers, it turns out, were known throughout the rest of Greece for something specific. The way they raised their children almost entirely without swaddling, without the tight wrapping that most ancient Mediterranean cultures used to keep infants still and calm. Let's stay in this house a little longer. Time moves differently now. Months blur into seasons, seasons into years. But I want you to stay close to this, mother, because the next 7 years matter more than you might think. They're the quiet years. The years almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. And they're the years that make everything that comes after so much harder to understand and so much harder to watch. You'd think, given everything we just witnessed, that a Spartan mother might hold back, might protect herself a little emotionally from a child she knows she'll eventually lose, might love him a little less fiercely just to soften the blow that's coming. She doesn't. If anything, it's the opposite. Picture early mornings in this house, the mother up before sunrise, the baby already awake, already being held, fed, sung to in a language we can only partially reconstruct from fragments of Spartan poetry that survived. Spartan mothers, it turns out, were known throughout the rest of Greece for something specific. The way they raised their children almost entirely without swaddling, without the tight wrapping that most ancient Mediterranean cultures used to keep infants still and calm. Shocking fact. Ancient writers tell us Spartan babies were deliberately left unbound, allowed to move their limbs freely from birth, exposed to cold rather than constantly wrapped in warmth, and trained, even as infants, not to cry when frightened or left alone in the dark. Other Greeks considered this almost shockingly harsh, but here's the detail that might surprise you. Many modern doctors, completely unaware of ancient Spartan practices, would actually recognize pieces of this approach. Unrestricted movement strengthens infant muscles faster. Controlled exposure to mild cold can build resilience. Sparta had stumbled, almost 2,500 years before modern pediatrics existed, onto fragments of something that wasn't pure cruelty. It was an entire philosophy of child-rearing, built around a single belief: comfort makes you fragile, and fragile things don't survive. You watch this mother apply that philosophy every single day, in small, almost invisible ways. She doesn't rush to comfort her son the instant he stumbles and falls. She waits just a beat longer than feels natural to you, watching to see if he'll push himself back up. When he does, and you can see it in her face, there's no triumphant smile, no exaggerated praise, just a small quiet nod. Good, that's expected. That's normal here. It's strange, isn't it, sitting with this? Because it would be so easy to simply call this neglect and walk away from the story feeling sure of that judgment. But if you stay a little longer, if you really watch her, you start to notice something else underneath the discipline. This isn't a mother who doesn't love her son. This is a mother who has been taught her entire life that love and softness are two completely different things, and that real love, Spartan love, means preparing your child for the only world he will actually have to survive in. Because that's the part it's easy to forget. Isn't it, from where we're sitting, centuries later in comfortable beds, with locks on our doors and no enslaved, population 7 times our size waiting for a single moment of weakness. In Sparta, gentleness wasn't free. Every soft, comfortable, protected childhood came with a cost that someone eventually would have to pay, often in blood, often on a battlefield, often in a single unprepared moment that could collapse the entire fragile order holding their society together. So she teaches him early, not through cruelty, but through small, consistent expectations. By the time he's 3, he's expected to entertain himself for long stretches without needing constant attention. By 4, he's already spending time with other boys his age in the neighborhood, learning through unsupervised play the kind of rough-and-tumble negotiation skills Sparta valued, settling disputes physically, learning when to push and when to back down, learning that crying rarely solved anything in a world like this one. By 5, you start to notice something shifting in how he looks at his mother, less like a small child clinging to safety, and more like a boy who has already begun, quietly, instinctively, preparing himself for a separation he doesn't fully understand yet, but somehow already senses is coming. She knows, better than he does, exactly how much time is left. There's a particular evening I want you to picture with me, sometime when he's 6 years old, almost 7. The two of them are sitting outside as the sun sets behind the mountains, the same mountains, in fact, that hold that chasm we talked about earlier, though by now it's just part of the landscape to him, not something he thinks about. She's telling him a story, the way mothers everywhere have told their children stories for thousands of years. But listen closely to what kind of story it is. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a myth about gods and monsters, though Sparta certainly had those too. It's a story about a Spartan soldier, maybe his own grandfather, maybe a more distant ancestor. The details get hazy with each retelling, who held his position in battle even after being wounded, refusing to fall back, refusing to let his fellow soldiers see him in pain. The boy listens with the particular intensity that children reserve for stories about people they're related to, You can see him imagining himself in that story already, not as the boy who waited safely at home, but as the soldier in the front line. That right there is the real secret of Spartan motherhood. It's not that these mothers didn't love their sons enough to protect them. It's that they loved them in a way specifically designed for the world they actually lived in, a world where softness genuinely could get you. Or your entire city killed. They weren't raising children for comfort. They were raising children for survival, in the only sense their civilization understood survival to mean. And so even as that final year creeps closer, even as you can feel, sitting here with them in the fading evening light, that something is about to end, there's no sense of dread in this house tonight. Just a mother and her son, watching the sun disappear behind Taygetus, the mountain that once decided whether he'd be allowed to live at all, now simply part of the quiet backdrop of an ordinary evening. Soon, very soon, men will come to this door again, not elders this time, checking for weakness in a newborn's body. Soldiers, coming to take a 7-year-old boy away from everything he's ever known. And his mother, when that day finally arrives, will do something that might be the hardest part of this entire story to understand. She will let him go without a single tear. Okay, this is the morning we've been building toward. I want you to really sit in this one with me. Because everything we've talked about so far, the inspection, the unbound infancy, the quiet years of preparation, all of it has been leading to this single day. It's early. The light outside is that pale, gray-blue color the sky turns just before sunrise, when the world feels suspended, like it's holding its breath. You're standing in the same small house we've been in this whole time, except now it feels different, smaller somehow. Or maybe it just feels smaller because you know what's coming. The boy is 7 years old today, or close enough to it. Spartan record-keeping wasn't precise the way ours is, but this is roughly the age, the threshold every Spartan boy crossed at the same point in his life. He's already awake. You notice he's dressed differently than usual, simply practically. Nothing that would mark him as someone who'd need carrying or comforting. His mother dressed him herself before the sun was even up, her hands moving through a routine she has clearly thought about, maybe even rehearsed in her mind, more times than she'd ever admit out loud. There's no breakfast lingering at the table, no long tearful embrace. If you didn't know what today was, you might think this was an ordinary morning, a little quieter than usual, maybe, but nothing more. That quiet is the loudest thing in the room. Outside you hear footsteps, not the slow, deliberate steps of elders coming to inspect a newborn. These are different, younger, more numerous. A small group of older boys, maybe 12 or 13 years old, has come to the door. This is part of the system too, something most people don't realize when they first hear this story. It's not soldiers or officials who collect 7-year-old boys from their homes. It's other boys, slightly older boys, already a few years into the agoge. Sparta's brutal state education and training system, sent to retrieve the newest members of their ranks. There's something almost stranger about that, isn't there? If a stranger, an adult, an authority figure had come to the door, you could understand the fear, the formality of it. But these are children, children sent to take other children, and in a way, that detail tells you everything. You need to know about how deeply this system had already shaped an entire generation. Boys who, only a few years earlier, had stood exactly where this 7-year-old now stands, doing exactly what's about to happen to him, to someone else. The mother kneels down. This is the moment. You can feel it. She doesn't cry. We've talked about this already, but it's worth sitting with again, right here in this exact moment, because knowing it intellectually and watching it happen in front of you are two very different things. She places both hands on her son's shoulders, looks him directly in the eyes, and says something that ancient writers actually preserved for us. Not from this specific mother. We don't know her words exactly, but from Spartan mothers generally. A phrase repeated so often, it became almost ritual, almost scripture. Shocking fact. The most famous version of this phrase comes from Plutarch, who recorded Spartan mothers telling their sons, as they handed them a shield before battle, "Come back with this or on it, Gaius," meaning, return victorious carrying your shield, or return dead, carried upon it as a funeral bier. Surrender, retreat, or cowardice were not acceptable outcomes. For a 7-year-old boy leaving home for the very first time, the message wasn't quite that severe yet. But the seed of it was already being planted. Right here, on this doorstep, years before he'd ever hold a real weapon. The boy doesn't cry either. And here's something that might be the hardest part of this whole story to really absorb. It's not because he's forcing himself not to. It's because by this point, after 7 years of careful, deliberate preparation, he genuinely doesn't feel the same fear a child from almost anywhere else in the ancient world would feel in this moment. He's been taught gently and consistently, his entire short life, that this morning was always coming. There's no betrayal in it. No shock, just the next expected step. He turns and walks toward the older boys waiting at the door. His mother doesn't follow him outside. This too is deliberate. Watching your son walk away, lingering in the doorway, calling after him. These were all things that would mark her, publicly, as someone too attached, too soft, someone whose love for her child outweighed her loyalty to the city. So instead she stays just inside the doorway, watching through the dim morning light as her son's small figure disappears down the path with the older boys, toward the barracks that will be his home for the next 13 years. 13 years. Let that sink in for a second. He will not return to live in this house again. Not really. Not in any permanent sense, until he is 20 years old. From this morning forward, his mother will see him only in passing, at festivals, at public events, brief encounters across a distance that both of them have been trained their entire lives to accept without protest. And here's the detail that I think is the most quietly devastating part of this entire story, the part that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. She goes back inside. She picks up whatever task she was doing before dawn broke. There was always a task, always something practical to return to. And she continues her day, not because she doesn't feel anything. Ancient writers, even ones who admired Sparta's discipline, occasionally hint at private grief. Spartan mothers were never permitted to show in public. But she continues her day because that too was the only acceptable response. Grief in Sparta was something you were allowed to carry, but never allowed to display. Somewhere down that path, her son is walking toward a barracks full of strangers his own age, about to begin one of the most brutal childhood education systems in recorded human history. A system built not around comfort or even around kindness, but around a single unyielding belief that suffering, carefully controlled and deliberately inflicted, was the only reliable way to forge a person strong enough to survive what the world might eventually demand of him. He doesn't look back. And in the next part of our story, we follow him through that door, into the agoge itself, into the barracks, the deliberate hunger, the punishments, and a ritual practiced at the temple of Artemis, so brutal that even other ancient Greeks, people accustomed to harsh customs, found it difficult to watch. Segment 6, Life Inside the Agoge, 300 words. Follow me through this door. This is the barracks now, and I want you to notice right away how different the air feels in here compared to the small warm house we just left. There's no oil lamp glowing softly in the corner, no woven blankets, no familiar smell of bread or olive oil, just rows of low wooden bunks, stone walls, and the sound of maybe a dozen other boys all around the same age, all going through exactly what your boy is about to go through. This is the agoge. The word literally means raising or training, though by the time you've spent a few minutes inside it, you'll understand it's closer to forging. Not raising a child the way we'd understand that today. Forging one the way you'd forge a blade. Heat, pressure, repetition, until something soft becomes something that doesn't bend. The first thing you notice is how little these boys actually have. No personal belongings beyond a single cloak, worn year-round regardless of season. No shoes. Spartan boys went barefoot deliberately, year after year, to toughen the soles of their feet for marching across rough terrain without complaint. Their hair is cut short, except in later years when it's allowed to grow long again, a strange Spartan tradition tied to vanity and pride that only fully developed warriors were considered to have earned the right to display. And then there's the food, or rather the lack of it. Shocking fact, Spartan boys in the agoge were deliberately, systematically underfed. Not occasionally, not as punishment, as standard policy. The rations provided were intentionally insufficient, and boys were expected to make up the difference by stealing additional food. From gardens, from kitchens, from anywhere they could find it. This wasn't an oversight in the system. It was the system. Sparta wanted its future soldiers to learn how to live off very little, how to forage and steal under pressure without panicking. Survival skills they'd desperately need on long military campaigns, far from any guaranteed supply line. But here's the part that I think reveals something darker and more deliberate about what Sparta was actually teaching. It wasn't just stealing the food that mattered. It was not getting caught. If a boy was caught stealing, he wasn't punished for stealing. He was punished for being clumsy enough to get caught. Ancient writers recorded stories, and historians still debate how literally to take these of boys enduring brutal beatings, not because they'd broken a rule, but because their technique had failed. The lesson Sparta was teaching, over and over, meal after missed meal, was unmistakable. It's not wrong to do whatever's necessary to survive. It's only wrong to be incompetent about it. Sit with that for a second, because I think it tells you more about Spartan values than almost anything else in this entire story. This wasn't a society obsessed with traditional morality in the way we might define it. It was a society obsessed with one single quality above all else: effectiveness. Whatever made you a more capable, more resilient soldier was considered virtuous. Whatever made you weak, slow, or dependent was considered a failure, almost regardless of the specific action involved. The boy you've been following, let's go back to him now. Lying on his thin bunk that first night, in the barracks, is hungry, in a way he's genuinely never experienced before. At home, even with the early lessons in self-reliance, even with the deliberately unsoftened upbringing, he was never actually starved. Now his stomach aches in the dark, and there's no mother nearby to quietly slip him something extra. Just other boys equally hungry, some of them already a year or two into this system, already hardened in ways he hasn't caught up to yet. He'll learn quickly. They all do, or they don't survive long in this environment. Within weeks, he'll be slipping into vegetable gardens at dusk, learning the particular silence required to lift food without disturbing a single leaf. Within months, he'll understand, instinctively, the specific kind of fear that comes not from doing something wrong, but from doing something wrong badly. And the hunger isn't the only thing being deliberately controlled here. Sleep, too, becomes something earned, rather than simply given. Boys in the agoge famously slept on beds they made themselves, from reeds gathered from the banks of the Eurotas River, and crucially, without knives. They had to break the reeds by hand, which meant the beds were often rough, uncomfortable, full of sharp, broken edges. In winter, older boys were sometimes permitted to add thistledown to their bedding for extra warmth, a small privilege earned only through time and endurance, never simply given to a new arrival. Shocking fact, historians studying these Practices have pointed out something genuinely uncomfortable when you compare it to the modern world. Many elements of agoge training bear striking resemblance to techniques used in modern military, special forces selection programs, sleep deprivation, engineered scarcity, public competition designed to expose weakness, group living conditions, specifically built to strip away individual identity in favor of collective loyalty. Sparta didn't have the language of modern psychology, but somehow, through centuries of trial and brutal error, they arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about how to break down a person's instinct for individual comfort and rebuild it around obedience to a larger group. The boys are organized into something called agoge, herds, literally the same word used for groups of animals. It's a deliberately dehumanizing term, and historians believe that was entirely intentional. Individual identity was, in a very real sense, the enemy here. The goal wasn't to raise a collection of unique, talented young men. The goal was to dissolve 7-year-old individuals into a single, interchangeable unit. Boys who would one day stand shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx formation, where individual heroics meant far less than absolute, unbreakable unity, with the soldier standing beside you. By the end of his first month, the boy you've been following barely resembles the child who walked away from his mother's doorstep. He's thinner, quieter. He's learned the particular alertness required to sleep lightly, to wake instantly, to never fully relax even in rest. He's learned which boys in his herd can be trusted, and which ones will report a stolen piece of bread to an instructor in exchange for slightly easier treatment for themselves. He has not, however, learned the hardest lesson yet. That one is still coming. A ritual practiced at a temple just outside the city, dedicated to the goddess Artemis, involving a kind of deliberate, public suffering so extreme that ancient visitors to Sparta, people from cultures that were themselves no strangers to harsh discipline, described it as one of the most disturbing things they had ever witnessed. There's a path that leads out of the barracks, past the training grounds, down toward a small temple on the banks of the Krypteia River. I want you to walk it with me now, because this is the place where everything we've talked about so far, the hunger, the discipline, the deliberate hardening of these boys, reaches its most extreme expression. The temple is dedicated to Artemis Orthia, a local form of the goddess Artemis, worshipped here in a way that doesn't really resemble worship anywhere else in the Greek world. By the time the boy we've been following is a little older, historians place this ritual happening to boys somewhere in their early to mid-teens. Though the exact age shifted over the centuries, he'll be brought here, along with the rest of his herd, for something called the diamastigosis. It means, roughly, the whipping contest. Picture it with me. A crowd has gathered, not just instructors and elders this time, but ordinary Spartan citizens, families, sometimes even visitors from other Greek cities, who'd heard about this ritual and traveled specifically to witness it. There's an altar at the center of the temple grounds, and beside it a position where boys, one at a time, are made to stand or kneel, sometimes holding cheeses that rest on the altar, an old detail from ancient sources, possibly the remnant of an even older ritual about proving a boy's right to a portion of food. And then, in front of this entire crowd, the boy is whipped, not symbolically, not a token gesture meant to represent suffering. Real whips wielded by instructors, striking the boy's bare back, again and again while everyone watches. The goal made is, and this is the detail that makes this ritual so different from simple punishment, wasn't to make the boy confess to wrongdoing or to discipline him for breaking a rule. The goal was endurance itself. How long could he stand there, in front of his entire community, and take it without crying out? Shocking fact, ancient sources including the Roman-era writer who described this ritual centuries after it began, claim that some boys died during this ceremony, not from a single accidental strike, but from the sheer accumulated trauma of the beating itself, while making no sound, no visible sign of pain, until their bodies simply gave out. Whether every detail of these accounts is historically accurate is something modern. Historians still debate. Ancient writers loved a dramatic story, and Sparta's reputation for extremity may have grown in the retelling over the centuries. But even allowing for exaggeration, archaeologists have found something that supports at least part of this account. Dedications at the temple site, inscriptions left by boys specifically honoring their endurance during this ritual, suggesting that surviving the diamastagosis without breaking was considered one of the highest honors a young Spartan could achieve. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. Imagine a society where the worst thing that could happen to you wasn't pain. It wasn't even death, though it was making a sound. It was visibly flinching, in front of people who were watching, specifically to see whether you would. Think about what that does to a person's relationship with their own suffering. In most cultures throughout most of human history, pain is something to be acknowledged, expressed, even shared. Crying out is how humans signal distress, how we ask instinctively for help or comfort. Sparta systematically dismantled that instinct in its young boys, replacing it with something closer to performance. Pain became a stage, and silence became the only acceptable script. Now here's something worth pausing on, because it connects back to everything we talked about earlier: the deliberately unbound infancy, the unsupervised play, the years of preparation before he was even taken from his mother's home. By the time this boy stands at that altar, this isn't the first time in his life. He's practiced staying silent through discomfort. His mother, all those years ago, sitting quietly while he stumbled and caught himself without rushing to comfort him. That wasn't unrelated to this moment. It was the first lesson in a long chain of lessons that all led here, to this exact spot, in front of this exact crowd. That's perhaps the most unsettling realization in this entire story. The diamastagosis doesn't look like an isolated, shocking ritual when you trace it back through everything that came before it. It looks like the final exam in a curriculum that began the moment he was born. And there's something else, something that complicates the picture even further if you sit with it long enough. The crowd watching this ritual wasn't made up of strangers reveling in a child suffering for entertainment. Many of them were parents. Some of them possibly were the very mothers who had once held these boys as infants, who had once felt that flicker of relief when the elders nodded their approval, all those years ago. And by this point in their lives, after their own years of cultural conditioning, these mothers genuinely believed they were witnessing something honorable, not torture, pride, the making of a Spartan man right in front of their eyes. It's worth asking yourself, sitting here in the dark, listening to this story, how does an entire community arrive at a place where this looks like love, where standing silently through a beating becomes something a parent watches with pride rather than horror? The uncomfortable answer is, the same way any extreme belief becomes normal anywhere, in any era, slowly, generation by generation, each step justified by the step before it, until something that would shock an outsider completely simply becomes. Tuesday afternoon at the temple, the boy survives his trial at the altar. He doesn't cry out, or if he does, it's quiet enough, brief enough, that it doesn't follow him into the stories his peers will tell about this day for years afterward. He walks away from that temple a slightly different person than he was when he arrived, carrying both the physical marks of what happened and something less visible, a deepened, almost unshakable belief that his own pain is something to be managed silently, alone, never shared, never fully expressed. That belief will follow him for the rest of his life, onto the battlefield, into his eventual marriage, into whatever relationship he someday has with his own children, if he survives long enough to have any. And it's not the last extreme test Spartan society has waiting for him, because somewhere around this same period of his adolescence, he'll be introduced to something even more disturbing than the whipping ritual. A secret, state-sanctioned program that historians consider one of the darkest, least understood aspects of Spartan society. A program that asked teenage boys to do something almost unthinkable, hidden in the darkness, away from any crowd at all. I need to tell you something before we go further into this part of the story. Of everything we've covered tonight, the inspection at birth, the deliberate hunger, the whipping ritual at the temple, what we're about to talk about now is, by most historians' accounts, the darkest chapter in the entire Spartan system. So if you're already drifting towards sleep, that's okay. Let this part wash over you gently. You don't need to hold on to every detail, just let the shape of it settle in. This is the Krypteia. The word comes from the Greek kryptos, meaning hidden, or secret, the same root we get words like cryptic from today. And it describes something genuinely unusual, even by Sparta's standards, a kind of secret service made up of the most promising teenage boys from the agoge, sent out alone at night into the countryside, armed only with a small dagger. Their official purpose, as far as historians can piece together, was twofold. First, to live off the land completely alone for extended periods, surviving through stealth and self-sufficiency, one final, extreme test of everything they'd learned since they were 7 years old. But the second purpose is the one that makes this so difficult to sit with. They were sent to monitor the helots. Remember them, the enslaved population we talked about earlier, the one that outnumbered Spartan citizens nearly 7-1, the deep, permanent fear that shaped almost everything about Spartan society. The Krypteia existed, at least in part, as a tool of control over that population. Selected boys would move through helot villages at night, watching, listening, identifying anyone who seemed too strong, too charismatic, too capable of organizing resistance. Shocking fact, ancient sources, including the philosopher Plato and the historian Plutarch, describe something almost impossible to process calmly. These teenage boys were, according to multiple ancient accounts, permitted, and in some interpretations, expected, to kill helots who seemed dangerous, threatening, or simply too independent, under the cover of darkness, without trial, without consequence, and without it counting as murder under Spartan law. Some ancient sources go further, describing an annual ritual in which Spartan authorities formally declared war on the helot population, a legal technicality that meant any helot killed during this period wasn't considered a crime at all, just a casualty of an officially sanctioned, ongoing state of conflict. I want to be honest with you about something here, because it matters for how we understand this story. Historians today actually debate how literally to take some of these ancient accounts. Several of our sources for the Krypteia were written, centuries after Sparta's peak, by writers who weren't always reliable, who sometimes exaggerated for dramatic effect, or who were working from older accounts that had already drifted from the truth through generations of retelling. It's entirely possible the Krypteia, as history remembers it, was somewhat less extreme than these accounts suggest, more focused on surveillance and intimidation than actual systematic killing. But here's what makes even that more measured. Possibility deeply unsettling on its own. Even in the most conservative interpretation, Sparta was deliberately taking boys who were perhaps 15, 16, 17 years old. Boys who, just a decade earlier, had been the small infants we watched being inspected by torchlight, and placing them in a role that required them to exercise lethal authority over other human beings alone, unsupervised in the dark, with essentially no oversight at all. Think back to everything that led here. The infant whose body was studied by elders. The toddler who learned not to expect comfort after a fall. The 7-year-old who walked away from his mother without crying. The boy who stood silently through a beating at the temple of Artemis. Every single stage of his upbringing had been building toward exactly this moment. A young man capable of acting alone without hesitation, without needing anyone else's permission or approval. In situations most adults today would find completely overwhelming. That's the part of this story I think is worth sitting with the longest tonight. Because it's tempting to look at the Krypteia and simply call it monstrous. Full stop and move on. And in many ways it was. But it didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the final logical conclusion of every single choice Spartan society had made about how to raise its children, going all the way back to that very first night, in that small stone house, when a mother bathed her newborn son in wine and waited to see if he'd cry. Sparta built an entire civilization around the belief that comfort makes you weak, that suffering builds strength. That emotional distance protects you from a world that offers no guarantees of safety. And if you follow that belief all the way to its furthest possible edge, without ever softening it, without ever questioning it generation after generation, eventually you arrive here, at teenage boys alone in the dark, deciding who lives and who doesn't, because an entire society raised them, deliberately, methodically, to be capable of exactly that. There's a quieter detail in all of this that doesn't get discussed as often, but that I think might be the saddest part of the whole Krypteia story. We have no surviving accounts, as not one, of how these boys felt afterward. No diary entries, no private letters, nothing that lets us peek behind the disciplined Spartan silence to understand what it actually did to a 16-year-old to carry that kind of responsibility alone at night, with no one to talk to about it afterward, because talking about it, showing any visible weight from it, would itself have been considered a failure of Spartan character. Whatever happened to those boys internally, they carried it the way they'd been trained to carry everything since infancy, silently alone without a single visible crack in the surface. And somewhere out there in a small house we visited earlier in this story, a mother who once held this same boy as a newborn has no idea what he's doing in the darkness tonight. No idea what kind of decisions he's being asked to make at an age when, in almost any other ancient society, he'd still be considered very much a child. This is the part of Spartan history that even other ancient Greeks, people from cultures with their own histories of violence and harsh discipline, found difficult to fully accept. The Krypteia represented something that went beyond military training, beyond even the brutal physical trials of the agoge. It represented a society willing to weaponize its own children, quietly, secretly, in service of maintaining control over people they had never stopped fearing. But there's another side to this story we haven't visited yet, one that might surprise you even more than what we've covered so far, because everything we've talked about tonight has focused on the boys. The sons, what about the daughters? What happened to Spartan girls, growing up in this same unforgiving city, under the watch of the same unyielding philosophy? Let's leave the barracks behind for a moment and walk somewhere most retellings of Spartan history never bother to take you. Because while every Spartan son was being shaped into a soldier through the system, we just spent the last several segments exploring something equally radical, equally unusual for the ancient world, was happening to Spartan daughters, just down the street, in plain sight, in a way that other Greek cities found almost as shocking as anything we've discussed tonight. Picture a courtyard, somewhere near the center of Sparta, in daylight this time. A group of girls, maybe 12 or 13 years old, are training together, running, wrestling, throwing javelins, competing against each other in foot races while a small crowd watches from the edges of the open space. If you'd shown this scene to someone visiting from Athens, just 100 miles away, they would have been scandalized. In Athens and in nearly every other Greek city-state, women and girls lived almost entirely indoors, separated from public life, rarely seen outside the home, except for specific religious festivals. Athenian girls weren't educated in any formal sense. They certainly weren't trained physically in public, in front of men who weren't their relatives. The idea would have struck most Greeks as not just unusual, but almost indecent. Sparta did the opposite, deliberately, systematically, and for reasons that connect directly back to everything we've already talked about tonight. Shocking fact, Spartan girls were given a state-sponsored physical education that included running, wrestling, javelin throwing, and discus, and ancient sources suggest they sometimes trained and competed while wearing significantly less clothing than was considered acceptable for women almost anywhere else in the Greek world. Other Greeks had a specific, mocking nickname for Spartan girls because of this. Phainomerides, roughly translated, thigh showers. It was meant as an insult, a way of suggesting Spartan women were immodest, almost scandalous. But the Spartans themselves seemed largely unbothered by this judgment. To them, a strong female body wasn't immodest, it was practical. Here's the reasoning behind it, and it connects to something we touched on earlier in this story without fully exploring. Sparta believed, with a conviction that was almost scientific for its time, that strong mothers produced strong children. Remember that very first inspection? The elders checking a newborn's limbs and spine for any sign of weakness. Spartans believed a significant part of whether a child was born, strong or weak, depended on the physical condition of the mother carrying him. So rather than confining girls indoors, weakening their bodies through inactivity, the way most of the ancient world did, Sparta trained its daughters almost as rigorously as its sons, specifically because they understood, correctly, as it happens, even by modern medical standards, a physically fit mother was more likely to survive childbirth and produce a healthier child. This wasn't feminism in any sense we'd recognize today. Let's be honest about that. Spartan girls weren't being trained for their own personal freedom, or because Spartan society valued women's independence the way we might value it now. They were being trained because their bodies were considered a kind of infrastructure, a resource the state needed to function properly, just as much as a soldier's body was a resource needed for the battlefield. It's a strange, uncomfortable kind of equality, born not from believing women and men deserved equal respect, but from believing both were equally essential tools in service of the same singular goal, a stronger Sparta. And yet, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, that practical reasoning still produced something genuinely unusual for the ancient world. Spartan women, as a direct result of this upbringing, ended up with a level of personal freedom, property rights, and public visibility that women almost anywhere else in ancient Greece simply didn't have. Spartan women could own land. Some historians estimate that by the later classical period, Spartan women owned as much as 40% of all land and property in Spartan territory, an almost unthinkable figure compared to Athens, where women legally couldn't own property at all and needed a male guardian's permission for nearly every significant decision in their lives. How did that happen? Largely because Spartan men were gone so often and for such extended periods. Remember, a Spartan man's life belonged to the state from age 7, and he typically didn't fully return to live with his family, even after marriage until his early 30s, with husbands and fathers constantly absent, fighting wars stationed at barracks, or simply living communally with other soldiers well into adulthood. Someone had to manage Spartan households, lands, and finances. That responsibility fell almost by necessity to Spartan women. The same system that tore mothers away from their newborn sons also, almost as a strange side effect, handed Spartan women a degree of practical authority and independence that would have been unimaginable to a woman living in Athens at the exact same moment in history. It's worth pausing here and asking yourself something. Drifting along with this story tonight, was Sparta progressive in some twisted, accidental way, or was this simply another expression of the same cold, transactional philosophy we've seen throughout this entire story? The belief that every person, regardless of gender, existed primarily as a resource for the state, valued not for who they were as individuals, but for what they could contribute to Sparta's survival. I think the honest answer is both somehow at the same time. Sparta managed to create real, tangible freedoms for women, physical fitness, land ownership, public visibility, even a notable freedom of speech that allowed Spartan women to voice blunt, unfiltered opinions in ways that shocked visitors from other Greek cities, while never once intending those freedoms as an act of genuine equality or respect. They were simply byproducts of a system obsessed, above everything else, with strength and survival. There's one more detail about Spartan girls worth sharing before we move forward. Something that ties directly back to where we started tonight. Just as boys were taken from their mothers, direct care at age 7 to begin their formal training, Spartan girls, while remaining at home rather than being sent to live in barracks, were placed into structured age-based groups for their physical and educational training as well, meaning even Spartan daughters experienced a kind of communal upbringing, shaped less by individual parenting and more by the collective expectations of the state from a remarkably young age. So even within the walls of that same small house where this story began, a daughter, had this mother had one, would have grown up shaped by many of the same underlying values as her brother, just expressed differently, channeled toward a different eventual purpose. Strength either way, self-reliance either way, just one path leading toward the battlefield and the other leading toward childbirth, land management, and an authority within the household that women elsewhere in Greece could only imagine. And eventually these two paths, the soldier and the strong, independent Spartan wife, would cross again, when this boy we followed his entire childhood finally returns home as a man, ready for marriage. But by then, after everything Sparta has shaped him into, what kind of relationship could he possibly build with a wife, or with the children they might someday have? By now you hardly remember what your mother's house smelled like. Maybe there was fresh bread baking somewhere in the courtyard, maybe olive oil, maybe sheep's wool drying under the warm sun. Or perhaps those memories have slowly dissolved into something softer, like a dream you can never quite reach. Instead, the scent surrounding you every morning is sweat, leather, damp straw, and smoke from last night's fire. That has become home. You wake before sunrise, long before birds begin singing across the hills of Laconia. Nobody needs to shout anymore. Your body has learned the rhythm. Sleep ends when everyone else's sleep ends. Around you, dozens of boys rise from the same rough bedding. No one complains. No one stretches lazily. No one asks for 5 more minutes. In Sparta, comfort is treated almost like an enemy. As you tie the single cloak that has become your constant companion through every season, you notice something strange. You no longer see strangers. Years ago, every face around you belonged to another frightened child who had also been separated from his family. Some cried during the first nights. Some whispered their mothers' names after everyone had fallen asleep. Some stared silently into the darkness. Now, you know every scar on their hands. You know who snores, who walks quietly, who steals extra bread without ever getting caught, who secretly fears heights, who can outrun everyone, who tells the funniest stories during rare moments when instructors aren't watching. Without realizing it, these boys have become something far more dangerous than friends. They have become brothers. Not brothers by blood, brothers by survival. And in Sparta, that difference matters enormously. I see. This wasn't an accident. The Spartan state understood something about human beings that modern psychology would later spend centuries trying to explain. People fight hardest for those they feel connected to. Not for abstract ideas, not always for kings, not even for cities, but for the person standing beside them, the man whose life depends on yours and whose survival depends on yours. The agoge wasn't simply teaching children how to fight. It was carefully dismantling old loyalties before replacing them with entirely new ones. Your biological family slowly faded into the background. Your true family became your unit. The boys who suffered beside you, bled beside you, went hungry beside you, endured punishment beside you. Every shared hardship tightened invisible threads between all of you. The instructors understood something almost cruel in its simplicity. Shared pain creates extraordinary trust. When everyone suffers equally, nobody suffers alone. I see. Imagine one freezing winter morning. Rain has been falling since before dawn. The ground has transformed into thick mud that clings to your bare feet. You haven't eaten much in 2 days. Your stomach growls constantly. The instructors order everyone to march into the hills carrying heavy bundles of wood. No questions, no explanations, only movement. Hour after hour, the wind slices through your thin cloak. Hands begin shaking. Legs grow tired. One younger boy stumbles. His bundle tumbles down the hillside. Without speaking, another boy immediately grabs part of the fallen load. Then another. Soon 3 boys are carrying what one boy could no longer manage. The instructor notices. You freeze. Surely punishment is coming. Helping another trainee sometimes meant weakening the discipline of the group. But instead, the instructor simply watches. He says nothing. Because this is exactly what Sparta wants. Not kindness, not compassion in the way we understand it today. Reliability, dependability, absolute certainty that no matter how exhausted you become, someone beside you will keep the formation together. Not because they love you, because your survival has become tied to theirs. Centuries later, military historians would still study why Spartan formations proved so incredibly difficult to break. It wasn't only superior weapons. It wasn't magical discipline. It wasn't physical strength alone. It was trust. A shield in the famous Spartan phalanx didn't only protect its owner. It protected the soldier standing to the left. If one man panicked, everyone became vulnerable. Every shield overlapped another. Every spear relied on another spear. Every heartbeat became part of a much larger machine. That machine could only function if every single person believed the others would never run. How do you create that kind of belief? Not through speeches, not through patriotic slogans. You create it during childhood. One freezing morning, one empty stomach, one shared punishment, one sleepless night at a time. As evening arrives, the instructors finally allow everyone to rest around a small fire. The meal is tiny, black broth, a few scraps of barley, perhaps a piece of cheese if fortune smiles upon the group. Nobody eats quickly. Every bite matters. Across the fire sits a boy you've known since your first day in the agoge. Years ago, both of you cried during the same thunderstorm. Neither admitted it afterward. Now, neither of you would ever mention it again. He notices you quietly shivering. Without speaking, he shifts slightly closer. The warmth from his cloak reaches yours. No words. No sentimental conversation. Just a silent understanding. In Sparta, affection rarely looked like hugs. It looked like sharing warmth, sharing food, standing closer during cold nights, taking the harder position during drills, watching another boy's back without being asked. Love existed. It simply wore a different face. The older boys sometimes told stories after dark. stories forbidden by instructors, whispered carefully beneath blankets. They spoke about famous Spartan warriors, not because those men had killed the most enemies, but because they had refused to abandon wounded companions. One story described a soldier who stayed beside an injured friend until both were surrounded. Neither survived. The tale wasn't told as tragedy. It was told as victory, because loyalty had remained stronger than fear. As you listen, something changes inside you. Death itself begins to seem less frightening than betrayal. That, more than any weapon, was Sparta's greatest achievement. I see. Modern societies often teach children to discover who they are as individuals. Sparta taught the opposite. Your individual identity mattered very little. Your value came from your usefulness to the group. At first this feels shocking, even unsettling, yet inside the agoge, it slowly becomes normal. When someone succeeds, everyone celebrates. When someone fails, everyone pays. Collective responsibility becomes woven into everyday life. If one boy neglects his duties, the entire group may lose food. If one trainee behaves poorly, everyone might receive punishment. This system forces something remarkable. You stop thinking only about yourself. Every decision affects everyone else. Selfishness becomes expensive. Cooperation becomes survival. I see. Sometimes late at night, when the stars stretch across the silent Spartan sky, you wonder what your mother is doing. Is she sleeping? Is she awake? Does she think about you? Would she even recognize your face now? The thought arrives quietly, then disappears just as quickly. Tomorrow begins before sunrise. There is no time to chase memories around you. The breathing of dozens of boys rises and falls in perfect rhythm. It sounds almost like waves rolling onto a distant shore. Strangely, that sound comforts you more than silence ever could. Perhaps, without noticing, you've already begun replacing one family with another. And in Sparta, that was never considered a loss. It was considered success. The years continue to pass almost without your noticing, because life inside the agoge is measured less by birthdays than by seasons of endurance. Summer means training beneath a relentless sun until your shoulders burn. Winter means sleeping with only the same rough cloak wrapped around your body while icy winds creep through every crack in the barracks. Somewhere along the way, the frightened child who once looked toward the road hoping to catch a glimpse of home quietly disappears. In his place stands someone who instinctively glances first toward the boys standing beside him. They have become the landmarks of your life. You know who breathes heavily after a long run, who limps when an old ankle injury flares up, who always pretends not to be hungry, even when his stomach growls loud enough for everyone to hear. When one of them is punished, you feel the knot in your own stomach tighten before the whip ever falls. When one succeeds, pride spreads through the group as though the victory belongs to everyone. It is an unusual way to grow up, one that slowly rewrites the meaning of family. Back in most Greek cities, brothers are born beneath the same roof. Here in Sparta, brothers are forged beneath the same hardships, hammered together by exhaustion, fear, discipline, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow will demand even more than today. Without realizing it, you begin trusting these young men with something more precious than your possessions. You trust them with your life, and that trust becomes stronger than many ties of blood. One evening, after another day of relentless drills, your group gathers for the evening meal known as the secretive. To an outsider, it hardly looks worth mentioning. There are no luxurious couches, no musicians filling the air with melodies, no servants presenting roasted meats on polished silver, trays like those enjoyed by wealthy families elsewhere in Greece. Instead, the meal is astonishingly plain. Bowls of the famous black broth are passed from hand to hand. Coarse barley bread is divided carefully, so every man receives his portion. Sometimes there is cheese, sometimes olives. On fortunate days, a little meat appears, though never enough to satisfy anyone completely. Yet these simple meals carry a significance far beyond nutrition. Every evening, the same faces gather around the same fire, sharing not only food but stories, laughter hidden beneath tired voices, and the silent understanding that each man has survived another day. Older warriors speak of campaigns fought years earlier, describing victories not as tales of individual heroism, but as moments when every shield held firm together. Younger boys listen with wide eyes, absorbing lessons that no instructor formally teaches. Loyalty is not explained through speeches. It is absorbed naturally, one shared meal after another. Eventually you realize something remarkable. When you imagine your future, the people seated around this humble fire appear more clearly than the family waiting back home. The Spartan state understood that armies are rarely held together by fear alone. Fear can make men obey for a while, but it cannot make them stand their ground when arrows darken the sky and enemy spears rush toward them. What keeps soldiers from running is often something far more personal. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx, your shield overlapping with the man beside you. You know his laugh. You know the scar running across his forearm from a training accident years ago. You remember stealing figs together as boys and accepting the punishment together afterward. You remember the freezing nights when he quietly shared part of his cloak without saying a word. Now, if you lower your shield and flee, you are not simply saving yourself. You are exposing him to death. His wife may become a widow because of your fear. His children may grow up without a father because your courage failed for a single heartbeat. Suddenly, bravery no longer feels like an abstract virtue celebrated by poets. It becomes a deeply personal promise made to the people you love most. This was the true genius behind Sparta's education. The city did not merely produce skilled fighters. It produced men who found the thought of abandoning one another almost unbearable. As you grow older, another change quietly unfolds. The memories of your mother begin arriving less often. At first, this realization fills you with guilt. You wonder whether forgetting her voice somehow makes you a bad son. You try to picture her face exactly as it looked the morning you left home, but certain details refuse to return. Was her hair tied back that day? Did she smile to hide her sadness? Did she watch until you disappeared down the road? The answers blur together like colors fading from an old painting left too long beneath the sun. Yet there are other faces you can recall with astonishing clarity. You remember the friend who broke his arm during wrestling practice, yet refused to cry. You remember another who nearly collapsed from hunger before slipping you half his bread despite needing it himself. Those memories remain sharp because you continue living beside them every single day. The Spartan system never ordered you to stop loving your parents. It simply surrounded you with a new reality so completely that old attachments gradually loosened on their own. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that transformation. No dramatic farewell. No declaration that one family has replaced another. Just thousands of ordinary days, each pulling your heart a little farther from the people who first held you as a child. Years later, when historians would describe Spartan courage, many focused on bronze armor, disciplined formations, or legendary battles like Thermopylae. Those things certainly mattered, but perhaps they overlooked something less visible. Before a Spartan warrior ever lifted a spear against an enemy, he had already spent more than a decade learning how to live for the people standing beside him. Every punishment had been shared. Every meal had been shared. Every freezing night, every blister, every bruise, every triumph, every humiliation belonged to the group rather than the individual. By adulthood, these experiences had woven invisible threads between them, stronger than iron chains. Modern psychologists often speak about social Identity, the idea that people define themselves through the groups they belong to. Sparta understood this principle over 2,000 years. Before the science existed to explain it, they simply practiced it, relentlessly, until the identity of I slowly dissolved into we. It came at a terrible personal cost, especially for parents who watched their children become strangers over the years. Yet from the perspective of the Spartan state, the sacrifice achieved exactly what it was designed to accomplish. A city defended not by isolated individuals, but by thousands of men who believed that losing a brother in arms would be far worse than losing their own lives. And somewhere beyond the walls of the barracks, another kind of strength has been quietly growing as well. While you have been learning to become a soldier, your mother has been learning something equally difficult: how to live with absence. Every festival, every harvest, every passing season reminds her that the little boy who once reached for her hand now belongs first to Sparta. She hears stories from returning warriors. She catches glimpses of young men marching through the streets in disciplined silence, wondering whether one of them is you. Sometimes she recognizes familiar features in passing: the shape of a jaw, the way someone walks. But the distance between mother and son has become wider than the road separating them. In Sparta, mothers are expected to carry this burden without complaint. Grief is treated as weakness. Pride is treated as duty. They are taught that raising a son does not truly mean keeping him close. It means preparing themselves to let him go, perhaps forever. It is a lesson almost as unforgiving as the agoge itself. As the fire burns lower and the conversations around you slowly fade into the quiet sounds of men drifting toward sleep, you pull your rough cloak a little tighter against the cool night air. The stars above Sparta are as brilliant as they were on the evening you first arrived here as a frightened 7-year-old. Yet everything else has changed. You no longer count the days until you can return home. Home has become a more complicated word than it once was. Somewhere beyond these hills lives the woman who gave you life. Here, beside this fading fire, sleep the young men who have helped shape the person you have become. Between those two worlds lies the heart of Sparta itself, a society that believed love could be redirected, loyalty could be engineered, and family could be rebuilt in service of the state. But while the city celebrates this transformation as its greatest triumph, one question still lingers quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be answered. What becomes of the mothers left behind, taught that the greatest proof of love is never allowing themselves to cry? That question leads us into the next chapter of the story. There is one person you have not truly seen in years, even though she has never stopped thinking about you. While your days have been filled with drills, punishments, long marches, and endless lessons about discipline, your mother has been living a different kind of battle, one fought entirely in silence. Imagine her standing outside the family home before sunrise, watching groups of young boys and young men pass through the streets of Sparta. Every broad shoulder, every familiar stride, every voice carried by the morning breeze makes her heart hesitate for just a moment. Is that you? Has your face changed so much that she would struggle to recognize it? In most Greek cities, mothers expected to watch their sons grow into adulthood under the same roof, guiding them through childhood and seeing them become husbands and fathers. But Sparta demanded something extraordinary. It asked mothers to surrender not only their sons, but also the ordinary joys of motherhood itself. From the day you entered the agoge, your relationship no longer belonged entirely to your family. It belonged to the state. The city believed that love was powerful, but dangerous. Too much affection, they feared, could soften a future warrior. So mothers learned to love from a distance, offering encouragement instead of comfort, pride instead of protection. To outsiders, this seemed almost impossible to understand. Yet within Spartan society, It was celebrated as one of the highest forms of civic duty. You might expect these women to be remembered as passive figures waiting quietly at home, but that image could not be further from reality. Spartan women enjoyed freedoms that shocked visitors from elsewhere in Greece. Unlike women in Athens, who often spent much of their lives within the household, Spartan women managed estates while their husbands trained or fought in distant campaigns. They owned property, inherited land, supervised servants, and played a visible role in the economic life of the city. They were also encouraged to exercise, run, wrestle, throw the discus, and strengthen their bodies from an early age. To many Greeks, the sight of women training outdoors was astonishing, even scandalous. The Spartans saw it differently. A strong mother, they believed, would bear strong children. Physical health was viewed as a responsibility to the state rather than a personal choice. Yet this unusual freedom came with an equally unusual burden. These women were expected to embody the same emotional discipline demanded of Spartan soldiers. Public displays of grief were discouraged. Excessive mourning could be interpreted as placing personal feelings above the needs of Sparta itself. The strength of a Spartan mother was measured, not by how tightly she held onto her children, but by how willingly she prepared them to leave. Perhaps no phrase captures this ideal more clearly than the one that has echoed through history for centuries. Return with your shield, or on it. Whether every Spartan mother actually spoke these exact words is uncertain, and historians continue to debate how often the saying was truly used. But the expression reflects an attitude deeply rooted in Spartan culture. A warrior who returned carrying his shield had stood firm in battle. A warrior carried home upon his shield had died with honor. Only the man who abandoned his shield to flee faced disgrace, because the large Spartan shield protected not only its owner but also the soldier standing beside him. Throwing it away meant abandoning the entire formation. Imagine hearing these words not as a famous quotation carved into a history book, but as advice from your own mother. She is not telling you that she wants you to die. She is telling you that there are things she believes are worse than death, dishonor, cowardice, betraying the men who trust you. From childhood, Spartan mothers understood that one day they might lose their sons. The culture did not ask them to stop loving. It asked them to redefine what love meant. Love became the courage to let someone fulfill their duty, even when that duty carried the possibility of never returning home. This expectation created moments almost unimaginable to modern audiences. Ancient writers describe mothers who greeted news of a son's heroic death with quiet dignity, while expressing shame if he survived through cowardice. These stories should be approached carefully, because many were written by authors outside Sparta who admired or criticized the city's values, and some accounts were likely exaggerated to illustrate moral lessons. Still, even allowing for exaggeration, they reveal how Sparta wished to be seen. Reputation mattered immensely. Every citizen understood that individual behavior reflected upon the entire community. Mothers therefore became guardians not only of children, but of family honor. Imagine standing in the marketplace after hearing that a battle has ended. Other women wait beside you. Messengers begin arriving. Some families celebrate. Others receive devastating news. Somewhere in your chest, hope and fear wrestle against one another. Then a messenger approaches with your son's name. In that instant, every memory of his childhood rushes back. The first time he walked, the nights you soothed him to sleep, the morning soldiers led him away at 7 years old, yet all eyes remain upon you. How will you respond? Will you collapse into grief, or will you straighten your shoulders, swallow your tears, and thank the gods that your son fulfilled his duty? Sparta expected the second response, no matter what storm raged inside your heart. For you, meanwhile, these expectations are almost invisible because they have surrounded you since childhood. You have been taught to believe that courage is ordinary, sacrifice is normal, and loyalty to Sparta stands above every personal desire. Only occasionally, during a quiet evening after training, do faint memories drift back. You remember your mother's hands fastening your cloak before winter mornings. You remember the warmth of home, though the details grow softer each year. Sometimes you wonder whether she still keeps anything that belonged to you, a small toy carved from wood, a blanket from infancy, perhaps nothing at all. Did she continue setting aside your favorite food during festivals before realizing you would never be there to eat it? Does she still glance toward the road whenever soldiers return from campaign? These questions have no place inside the agoge. They are never discussed, yet they linger quietly beneath the discipline, reminding you that before Sparta shaped you into a soldier, someone else first taught you how to walk, how to speak, and how to trust another human being. The city may claim your loyalty, but it can never completely erase those first invisible bonds. Looking back through the lens of modern psychology, the relationship between Spartan mothers and their children feels deeply paradoxical. Secure emotional attachment is now understood as one of the foundations of healthy childhood development, yet Sparta deliberately interrupted that attachment at an early age for boys, believing the needs of the state outweighed the needs of the individual family. Remarkably, the system endured for centuries, suggesting that many Spartans genuinely accepted its values rather than simply obeying them out of fear. Culture has an extraordinary power to shape what people consider natural. What seems heartbreaking to us may have appeared honorable to them. That does not mean the pain disappeared. Human emotions rarely vanish simply because society discourages expressing them. Instead, they often retreat beneath the surface, hidden behind rituals, expectations, and public performances of strength. Perhaps Spartan mothers cried only when no one could see. Perhaps they whispered prayers for sons they publicly claimed to have surrendered long ago. History cannot answer those questions with certainty. The written sources tell us about laws, customs, and ideals far more readily than they reveal private tears shed behind closed doors. As night settles once more over the valley of Laconia, you lie awake beneath the familiar stars, unaware that somewhere beyond the barracks, your mother may be looking at the very same sky. The distance between you is measured not only in miles but in years of carefully cultivated separation. Sparta has succeeded in turning frightened boys into disciplined young warriors. Yet every victory comes with a hidden cost. Somewhere, every fearless soldier was once a child held close by someone who believed they would never let go. The city demanded that both mother and son release that bond for the promise of something greater than themselves. Whether that promise was noble, tragic, or perhaps a little of both remains a question each listener must answer for themselves. As your training continues and adulthood approaches, another chapter of life quietly waits beyond the horizon. Not every child in Sparta followed the same path. While boys were forged into soldiers, the daughters of Sparta were growing into something equally unusual by the standards of the ancient Greek world. Their story, too, would surprise almost anyone arriving from Athens. While your days have been spent beneath the watchful eyes of instructors, learning how to survive hunger, punishment, and endless military drills, another generation has been growing, up only a short walk away, yet living a life that would seem almost unbelievable to the rest of the Greek world. If you had traveled north to Athens, you would have found many young girls spending most of their childhood inside the household, learning to weave cloth, prepare food, and manage domestic responsibilities. Education outside the home was limited for most of them, and physical training was rarely encouraged. But Sparta followed an entirely different philosophy. Here, as you march across dusty training grounds with aching muscles, young girls can be seen racing across open fields, wrestling one another, throwing javelins, hurling the discus, singing in public festivals, and exercising beneath the same bright Mediterranean sun. Visitors from other city-states often stared in disbelief. Some even criticized the Spartans, arguing that women behaving so freely threatened traditional Greek values. Yet the Spartans simply shrugged. They were not interested in pleasing outsiders. To them, every citizen had a role in strengthening the state, and that role began long before adulthood. If boys were trained to become fearless warriors, then girls were expected to become healthy, resilient women capable of supporting the society that produced those warriors. Imagine watching one of these training grounds after your own exhausting exercises have finally ended. A group of girls, perhaps only a few years younger than you, sprint barefoot across the earth with astonishing confidence. Dust rises behind their feet as instructors encourage speed rather than modesty. There are no heavy bronze shields here, no military formations, no barracks where they will spend years sleeping on reeds. Their lives are not copies of yours, yet they are far from easy. They compete in foot races, practice throwing events, dance in carefully organized choruses during religious festivals, and build strength through constant physical movement. Ancient writers describe Spartan women as noticeably taller and stronger than many women elsewhere in Greece, though these descriptions were often colored by admiration or surprise. Still, archaeology and historical evidence suggest that physical education truly played a significant role in Spartan female upbringing. The reasoning behind it was deeply practical. Healthy women, the Spartans believed, were more likely to give birth to healthy children. Strength was not merely admired, it was considered a civic responsibility. Modern ears may find this idea unsettling because it places enormous expectations upon women's bodies. Yet within Sparta, it formed part of a much larger system where nearly every aspect of life was judged according to what benefited the city. Perhaps even more remarkable than their physical education was the degree of independence many Spartan women enjoyed. Because husbands frequently spent years training, serving in military units or campaigning far from home, women often managed estates and households themselves. They supervised agricultural production, directed enslaved laborers, handled financial matters, and inherited property in ways that were uncommon elsewhere in Greece. By some estimates, Spartan women eventually controlled a significant portion of the city's privately owned land. To an Athenian visitor, this would have seemed astonishing. Greek comedians even mocked Spartan women for speaking too confidently and acting with what outsiders considered excessive freedom. Yet beneath these jokes lay an uncomfortable truth. Sparta had unintentionally created some of the most economically influential women in the ancient Greek world. This freedom, however, did not arise from a desire for equality in the modern sense. The Spartan state did not seek to liberate women because it believed in equal rights. Rather, it recognized that someone had to keep society functioning while so many men devoted themselves to military life. Once again, practicality outweighed ideology. The result was a society that looked surprisingly progressive in some respects while remaining deeply restrictive in others. As you grow older, you begin noticing these differences more clearly. During religious festivals, young women participate in public songs and dances celebrating the gods and the city itself. Unlike the secluded daughters of many other Greek communities, Spartan girls often appear before crowds with confidence that reflects years of public participation. Ancient poets describe choruses of young women singing playful verses, sometimes even teasing young men in ways that would have shocked visitors from elsewhere in Greece. These performances were not simply entertainment. They reinforced community identity, encouraged physical grace, and helped prepare young people for adult life. Marriage itself carried different expectations in Sparta. Women were expected to marry somewhat later than was common in many Greek cities, likely after reaching greater physical maturity. The Spartans believed this improved the health of both mother and child. While historians continue debating the exact ages involved, the general pattern suggests that Spartan women entered marriage with more physical development and social confidence than many of their contemporaries. Even so, personal choice remained limited. Like nearly every aspect of Spartan society, marriage ultimately served the interests of the state before the desires of individuals. Despite these unusual freedoms, it would be a mistake to imagine Sparta as an ancient paradise for women. Expectations remained immense. A woman's worth was still closely connected to her ability to strengthen the city through healthy children, efficient household management, and unwavering support for Spartan values. Mothers encouraged sons toward courage because society expected them to do so. Daughters were taught resilience because future generations depended upon it. The pressure was simply different from the burdens carried by men. Boys endured hunger, beatings, and military discipline inside the agoge. Girls carried the quieter weight of preserving households, producing future citizens and maintaining the social fabric, while fathers, husbands, and brothers trained for war. Neither path offered much room for personal dreams disconnected from the needs of Sparta. Individual identity always remained secondary to collective survival. In this way, the lives of Spartan boys and girls, though dramatically different in daily routine, were bound together by the same underlying philosophy. Every citizen existed to serve something larger than themselves. If an Athenian father had wandered through Sparta, he might have struggled to understand what he was seeing. Young women speaking confidently in public, girls racing through athletic competitions, mothers managing wealth and land, while husbands remained absent. To him, such scenes could appear almost upside down, as though the natural order of Greek life had been reversed. Yet the Spartans would likely have been equally puzzled by Athens. Why confine half the population, they might ask, when stronger women could help build a stronger state? Neither society considered itself unusual. Each believed its customs represented the proper way to organize human life. This reminds us that culture has an extraordinary ability to shape expectations so completely that people rarely question them. What one civilization praises, another condemns. What feels shocking in one era may feel ordinary in another. Sparta's daughters lived within this unique world, benefiting from freedoms denied elsewhere while simultaneously carrying responsibilities that many modern people would consider overwhelming. Their story resists simple labels of oppression or empowerment because it contains elements of both. As another year passes, adulthood begins drawing closer for everyone around you. The girls who once raced across open fields are becoming women prepared to manage households and continue Spartan traditions. You and your fellow trainees are approaching the final stages of an education that has transformed frightened children into disciplined young men. Soon, paths that have remained separate for years will begin to intersect once again, through marriage, family, and new responsibilities. Yet even then, the bonds formed inside the agoge will never fully disappear. Sparta has reshaped the meaning of family itself, and its effects will echo through every future relationship. Before long, you will discover that becoming a husband does not mean returning to ordinary family life. Even as a grown man, the city will continue demanding your loyalty first. The transition into adulthood, far from ending Sparta's influence, reveals just how completely it has claimed the course of your life. That is where our story travels next, into the strange and often surprising world of Spartan marriage, where love, duty, and the state remained forever intertwined. At last, the years of childhood begin slipping quietly behind you. The endless mornings of running barefoot through frozen fields, the sleepless nights beneath a single rough cloak, the hunger that once twisted your stomach into painful knots, and the countless drills that taught your body to move almost without thinking, have all shaped you into the man Sparta intended you to become. Yet there is a strange feeling growing inside you, one that no instructor ever prepared you for. Soon you will no longer be a boy of the agoge. You will become a citizen, a warrior, and eventually a husband. To someone from another Greek city, this would seem like the moment when life finally returns to normal. They would imagine you moving back into your parents' home, starting your own family, and leaving the hardships of childhood behind. But Sparta has no interest in normal endings. In fact, adulthood here begins with another lesson in sacrifice. You have spent years learning that your body belongs to the city. Now you discover that even your marriage will belong to Sparta as well. The transition from childhood to adulthood does not restore what was lost. Instead, it asks you to surrender even more. As you walk through streets that once felt familiar, neighbors greet you with respect, yet the place itself feels strangely distant. The house where you were born still stands, but it no longer feels entirely yours. Your mother smiles when she sees you, though for a brief moment both of you hesitate, uncertain whether to embrace or simply stand in silence. Too many years have passed, too many memories have been lived apart. You are no longer the frightened 7-year-old who looked back over his shoulder as he was taken away, and she is no longer simply your mother. Time, discipline, and distance have quietly transformed both of you. Marriage in Sparta surprises nearly every visitor who hears about it. Rather than immediately beginning life together beneath the same roof, many newly married Spartan couples spent years living apart. Military duty came first. Even after your wedding, you continue eating, training, and often sleeping with the military mess, the Syssitia, alongside the same brothers in arms who have shared your life since childhood. Historians believe young husbands often visited their wives only in secret during the early years of marriage, slipping through dark streets after nightfall before returning to the barracks before dawn. Imagine how unusual this must have felt. In most societies, marriage marks the beginning of shared daily life. In Sparta, it often began with separation. Ancient writers even describe the symbolic ritual in which a bride's hair was cut short and she was dressed in clothing resembling that of a young man before the groom secretly visited her. Scholars continue debating the precise meaning of this custom, but many believe it reflected the strange transition between military life and married life, a reminder that even intimacy existed within the rules established by the state. Romance, as modern audiences imagine it, occupied very little space in this system. Love was not forbidden, but it was expected to remain secondary to duty. Even your own household could not compete with the demands of Sparta's military discipline. When you visit your wife beneath the cover of darkness, the moments feel almost stolen from another life. The streets are quiet, lit only by scattered oil lamps and a sky crowded with brilliant stars. You move carefully, aware that before sunrise, you must once again return to your fellow soldiers. These brief meetings create a curious kind of relationship. Instead of sharing ordinary routines, preparing meals together, raising children side by side, talking through the events of each day, you experience marriage through fragments of time. Conversations become precious because they are so rare. A single evening together may need to sustain affection through weeks of separation. Some ancient writers even suggested that this distance helped preserve desire, preventing familiarity from dulling passion. Whether or not that was truly the reason, it reflected a broader Spartan belief. Too much comfort weakened discipline. Every part of life, even marriage itself, was shaped according to what leaders believed would produce stronger citizens. The needs of the individual couple mattered less than the imagined needs of the community. From a modern perspective, this arrangement may seem lonely. Yet for many Spartans, it simply represented the natural order of life. They had never known anything different. Then one quiet evening, you find yourself standing once again before the home where your childhood began. Your mother opens the door, and for a moment, neither of you speaks. She studies the man before her, the broad shoulders, the weathered hands, the calm expression that reveals years of disciplined self-control. Somewhere beneath all of that armor of habit, she searches for the little boy she once held close. You, meanwhile, notice details you had long forgotten. The familiar scent of olive oil, the worn stone threshold polished smooth by generations of footsteps, the courtyard where you once played before the agoge became your world. Memories return unexpectedly, not as clear pictures, but as quiet feelings lingering beneath the surface. Yet something has undeniably changed. Home no longer feels like the center of your life. You love your mother, but your instincts have been reshaped by years of communal living. When danger appears, your thoughts turn first toward the men who stand beside you in formation. When decisions must be made, you think like a soldier before you think like a son. Sparta has not erased your family, it has simply rearranged the order of your loyalties. The transformation is so gradual that you hardly noticed it happening until now. Standing once more beneath the same roof where everything first began, soon children of your own may enter the world. It is a joyful thought, yet it carries a shadow impossible to ignore. If your child is a son, you already know exactly what awaits him. You know the inspections. You know the years of separation. You know the hunger, the punishments, the freezing nights, the friendships forged through hardship, and the moment when he will one day glance back toward his own home exactly as you once did. Imagine holding your infant son for the first time while quietly realizing that one day you will have to let him go. Not because you wish to, but because every father before you has done the same. Your wife understands this as well. She too has grown up in Sparta. She has heard the stories, watched generations of boys disappear into the agoge, and learned from childhood that motherhood here means preparing for separation almost as soon as new life begins. The cycle continues, repeating itself from one generation to the next with remarkable consistency. Sparta does not rely on a single great leader or a single famous army. It survives because each generation teaches the next to embrace the same sacrifices, however painful they may be. Modern historians often ask whether Spartan families truly accepted this way of life or whether they simply lacked the freedom to imagine anything else. The honest answer is that we cannot know every private thought hidden behind closed doors. Ancient sources tell us much about ideals and public expectations, but far less about quiet conversations between husbands and wives after darkness fell. Surely some parents questioned the system, even if they never dared speak openly. Others may have believed wholeheartedly that their sacrifices protected the survival of Sparta. Human beings are wonderfully complex, capable of loving their children deeply while simultaneously believing those children must endure hardship for a greater purpose. That tension exists in many societies, not only ancient ones. Sparta simply carried it to an extraordinary extreme. Looking back across the centuries, it is tempting to judge their choices quickly. Yet history often reminds us that every civilization believes its own values are reasonable. The Spartans looked at the world around them and concluded that survival demanded discipline above all else. Whether they were right remains a question that continues to spark debate thousands of years later. As the years move steadily forward, the city around you remains much the same. Boys continue leaving their mothers behind. Young girls continue racing across open fields beneath the warm Laconian sun. Warriors gather each evening around humble meals, speaking quietly beside flickering fires before another day of duty begins. The rhythm of Sparta never truly stops. Yet beneath this remarkable machine lies something fragile that no law can fully control: the human heart. Children still long for their parents. Mothers still remember the sons who once clung to their hands. Husbands and wives still search for moments together, despite the demands of military life. Even in a society that devoted itself almost entirely to discipline, affection never disappeared completely, simply found quieter places to live. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of Sparta. A civilization determined to place the state above the family could never entirely erase the invisible bonds that make us human. As our journey approaches its end, only one question remains. After a lifetime spent serving Sparta, what truly survives within the hearts of those who lived it? The pride of duty, the pain of sacrifice, or perhaps a complicated mixture of both? That final reflection awaits us in the closing chapter. Now, as the years begin to blur together, imagine yourself standing on a quiet hillside overlooking the valley of Laconia. The battles have come and gone. The shouting has faded. The bronze armor that once seemed so important now rests quietly beside countless others, worn smooth by time. The city below still looks much as it always has, its fields stretching toward the distant mountains, its temples catching the last golden light of the evening. From here it is easy to admire Sparta for its discipline, its determination, and the extraordinary warriors it produced. History often remembers victories, famous battles, and legendary courage. But from this peaceful distance, another question begins to emerge, one that ancient writers rarely stop to ask. What became of the ordinary moments that never made it into history? The bedtime stories that were never finished? The scraped knees a mother never had the chance to comfort? Modern psychology gives us language that the Spartans themselves never possessed. Today we understand how deeply early relationships shaped the developing mind. The bond between a young child and a caregiver creates more than comfort. It becomes the foundation upon which trust, emotional security, and later relationships are often built. From that perspective, the agoge appears almost shocking. Removing boys from their mothers at the age of 7 interrupted a relationship that many psychologists now consider profoundly important. Yet human beings are remarkably adaptable. Children who lose one attachment often build another. In Sparta, those new attachments formed inside the barracks, among fellow trainees, mentors, and lifelong companions. The city had in effect redirected the natural human need for belonging. Instead of eliminating attachment, it carefully replaced one kind with another. Your deepest loyalty shifted from family to comrades, from household to city, from private love to collective identity. Whether this transformation should be admired or mourned depends largely on the values each listener brings into the story. The Spartans believed they were creating citizens capable of extraordinary courage. Modern observers often wonder whether they also created generations, quietly carrying losses they had never been allowed to express. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within Sparta's history. Human beings can grow accustomed to almost anything when an entire culture tells them it is normal. The boys entering the agoge did not believe they were victims. Most likely they believed they were beginning an honorable journey shared by generations before them. Their mothers probably believed that raising courageous sons brought honor to the family. Fathers likely accepted the system because they themselves had once lived through it. Customs become powerful not because every individual agrees with them, but because each generation inherits them before it is old enough to question them. This is true not only of ancient Sparta, but of every society throughout history, including our own. Looking back across more than 2,000 years, it is tempting to imagine ourselves making different choices. Yet every age carries beliefs that future generations may one day find equally surprising. History has a quiet way of reminding us that certainty rarely lasts forever. If there is one image that lingers after this journey, perhaps it is not a battlefield at all. Perhaps it is something much simpler. A 7-year-old Boy looking back one last time before disappearing down the road toward the agoge. A mother standing in the doorway, keeping her shoulders straight because that is what her city expects, even though every instinct tells her to run forward and hold her child. Just a little longer. Neither of them knows exactly what the coming years will bring. Neither understands how much they will change. The boy cannot imagine becoming the disciplined warrior history will one day admire. The mother cannot yet know that the little child she kisses goodbye will return as a man whose strongest bonds have been forged elsewhere. There is no villain standing between them, no single cruel ruler forcing them apart. Instead, there is something far more powerful, an entire society convinced that this sacrifice serves a greater good. That realization makes the story of Sparta feel less like a fairy tale and more like a deeply human tragedy, one where love never disappears, but is constantly asked to stand aside for duty. And now the fire has nearly burned itself out. The voices inside the barracks have faded into silence. Somewhere beyond the hills, the wind moves gently through ancient olive trees, just as it did when Sparta still stood among the most feared cities in Greece. The boys who once marched proudly across these fields are long gone. Their shields have rusted away. Their names, with only a few famous exceptions, have disappeared into history. Even Sparta itself would eventually decline, unable to preserve forever the society that seemed so unbreakable. Time, as it always does, proves stronger than even the most disciplined army. Yet stories like these continue to survive because they ask questions that never grow old. What makes a good parent? How much should a society ask its children to sacrifice? Can courage exist without compassion? Can strength exist without tenderness? The Spartans answered those questions in one extraordinary way. We may answer them differently today. But perhaps the greatest value of history is not discovering who was right or wrong. It is allowing us to understand how differently human beings have searched for the same: hopes, safety, belonging, purpose, and a future for the next generation. So as your eyes grow heavier and the night settles comfortably around you, let the streets of ancient Sparta slowly disappear into darkness. Let the clang of bronze shields fade into distant echoes. Let the training grounds fall silent beneath the stars. And perhaps just before sleep arrives, remember not only the legendary warriors whose names filled history books, but also the quiet mother standing in her doorway, watching her little boy walk away toward a life neither of them truly chose alone. Thank you for traveling through ancient Sparta with me tonight. Rest well, sleep deeply, and when morning comes, you can be grateful that the world you wake in to ask something very different of childhood than the one we have just left behind. Good night.